It was the summer of 1942. Across the endless fields of southern Russia, the horizon shimmered with heat and dust. German trucks and tanks rolled forward, engines roaring under the merciless sun. The soil had long since dried to powder, rising in great brown clouds that clung to the uniforms of the advancing Wehrmacht. For the men of Hitler's Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, this was to be the final push toward the Volga. The orders were clear: take Stalingrad, secure the flank of the southern offensive, and cut Soviet supply lines once and for all. The city itself stretched for 30 miles along the great river, an industrial fortress of steelworks, grain elevators, and oil tanks. It was more than a name. Stalingrad carried the weight of its leader, Joseph Stalin, and for both sides its fate would soon become symbolic of the entire war. In Berlin it was said the city's capture would cripple Soviet morale. In Moscow it was said its defense would save the motherland. By mid-July, German armored divisions had swept across the Don River. Soviet defenses were collapsing, and the Red Army was falling back in confusion. The steppe was littered with burnt vehicles, broken artillery, and scattered bodies, evidence of a retreat that had turned to chaos. Refugees crowded the roads, peasants pushing carts, mothers clutching their children as the rumble of tanks grew louder behind them. Overhead, Luftwaffe bombers circled, hunting columns of retreating troops. The war had turned into an inferno of movement, smoke, and fear. In the city of Stalingrad itself, life was changing by the hour. Factory whistles still blew, but the workers no longer built tractors or locomotives. The plants had been converted for war production, tanks, shells, and rifles rolling out under the roar of air raid sirens. The sound of hammers and machinery echoed from the Red October factory, the Barricadi gunworks, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor plant. The smell of oil and smoke hung heavy in the air. Even as the German front drew closer, the city refused to stop. Civilians were urged to evacuate across the Volga, but few could. Barges were overcrowded, and German air raids made the crossings deadly. The sky filled with the black silhouettes of Stuka dive bombers, their sirens screaming as they plummeted. Bombs exploded along the riverbanks, shattering docks and setting warehouses ablaze. The heat from the flames turned the air itself into a trembling haze. Within days, entire districts were reduced to rubble. Still, many civilians stayed, not out of courage, but because they had nowhere else to go. In Moscow, Stalin issued his infamous order, not one step back. It was Order number 227. Any retreat without command authorization was to be punished by death. Blocking detachments were formed, soldiers tasked with shooting their own comrades if they tried to flee. Fear became as constant as the artillery shelling. The defense of Stalingrad would be total. By August, the Germans had reached the outskirts. The 16th Panzer Division crossed the Don, pushing toward the Volga's western bank. From the high ground, German observers could see the river glinting like a silver line in the distance. They could also see the city burning. Artillery opened up, hammering the suburbs and factories. Soviet anti-aircraft guns barked from rooftops, but the Luftwaffe's dominance was overwhelming. Waves of Heinkel, He-111s and Junkers Ju-88s turned the sky into a storm of fire. On August 23, 1942, the great bombing began. Nearly 1,000 tons of explosives dropped in a single day. The result was catastrophic. Tens of thousands of civilians died in the firestorm. Entire neighborhoods vanished beneath clouds of dust and smoke. Wooden houses ignited instantly, while steel factories melted under the heat. The Volga itself ran black with oil from shattered storage tanks. the smell of burning fuel mixed with that of flesh. Even the German pilots circling above the inferno could see that the city was being erased. Yet in that destruction something hardened. Soviet troops, many newly arrived from the east, began to dig in. Barricades went up along every street. Machine gun nests were built from bricks and sandbags. Women and children filled sandbags and carried ammunition. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, took control of the river crossings and organized what remained of the civilian defense. For them, the city had become a fortress. For the Germans, it was a maze waiting to swallow them. When the first German infantry entered the northern suburbs, they found not empty streets, but shadows. Soviet snipers watched from broken windows, waiting for the first movement. Every building became a battlefield, every floor a line of defense. The Germans were trained for blitzkrieg, swift, coordinated attacks with armor and air support. But in the ruins of Stalingrad, tanks could not maneuver. Streets were blocked with debris, tramcars overturned, walls collapsed. Soldiers fought for rooms, staircases, and even basements. The city turned into a vertical battlefield, up, down, and below ground. Night brought little relief. The fires glowed red across the skyline, casting long shadows through the smoke. The Volga's surface flickered with the reflection of burning oil. Soviet gunboats ferried reinforcements across the river, under constant bombardment. Many never made it. The boats sank, their passengers disappearing into the black water. Those who survived arrived soaked, coughing, half-deaf from explosions, only to be handed rifles and sent straight into the ruins. By September, Paulus's Sixth Army had taken much of the city's western bank. The German command reported victory was near. Yet every time they cleared a building, more Soviet soldiers emerged from the rubble. They called themselves the Rats of Stalingrad. The Germans began calling the battle Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. Even elite units like the 24th Panzer Division were ground down street by street. Civilians continued to hide in basements, surviving on rainwater and scraps of food. Many were trapped beneath collapsed buildings. The air was filled with the constant roar of artillery. On both sides, morale began to strain. German soldiers wrote in their diaries that the city never ends, that they fought for the same house for 3 days, only to lose it again by nightfall. Soviet troops described the same horror, comrades dying beside them, the endless cold nights, the stink of the dead. The Red Army began to use the terrain to their advantage. Snipers like Vasily Zaitsev became legends, killing dozens of German officers and machine gunners. Soviet engineers booby-trapped entire streets. German tanks rolled forward only to detonate from hidden mines. The Luftwaffe's air superiority began to fade as Soviet fighters from distant airfields struck back. Each day the front line moved by only a few meters. As autumn arrived, the first snow fell on the ruins. Smoke froze in the air, drifting like mist between broken walls. The Volga began to ice over at the edges. Supplies became harder to deliver, yet the fighting did not stop. For the soldiers trapped within the ruins of Stalingrad, time itself lost meaning. The city was no longer a place. It was a struggle between two nations, two ideologies, and two wills that refused to yield. By October 1942, the once proud metropolis had become unrecognizable. The population that had once numbered 500,000 was reduced to a few thousand starving survivors. Still, Soviet resistance continued, sustained by the river and by Stalin's relentless orders. Paulus's men, exhausted and freezing, reported that every ruin contained Russians even when it should not. The Battle of Stalingrad had only begun. By November 1942, Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a skeleton of itself. Broken walls, blackened chimneys, and endless rubble stretching from the Volga's edge to the smoking hills in the west. Snow had begun to fall, blanketing the ruins in a thin layer of white that quickly turned grey from soot and ash. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and the wind that blew from the steppe carried the bite of death. For both armies, the city had become a tomb without walls. The German Sixth Army still held most of the western bank. Paulus's men had pushed deep into the ruins, capturing the Red October factory, the Barricadi gunworks, and the northern suburbs. But their progress had come at a staggering cost. Every street, every basement had been fought for and lost again. Ammunition was scarce. Food was scarcer. Soldiers warmed their hands over burning debris and melted snow for water. The glory of the summer advance had vanished, replaced by exhaustion and cold. The Luftwaffe still ruled the sky, but its bombers now had fewer targets to destroy. The city was already dead. Their supply missions, once steady, grew inconsistent as Soviet anti-aircraft fire thickened. Stalingrad had become a grinder, devouring men and machines without pause. In the Soviet lines, things were no better. Across the Volga, the eastern bank was choked with wounded men, shattered units, and endless convoys of ammunition and supplies. That night, small boats crossed the river under constant shell fire, bringing reinforcements, many of them untrained recruits who had never fired a rifle before. They arrived terrified, freezing, but determined. The city's defenders were running on willpower alone. Among them, General Vasily Chuikov had taken command of the 62nd Army. A hard, practical man, he turned the ruins into fortresses. His orders were simple: hold Stalingrad or die there. Communication lines were destroyed daily, but the defense held through sheer tenacity. Chuikov's headquarters was buried under a mound of earth near the Volga bank, damp, cold, and shaking from constant bombardment. His voice, transmitted through crackling radios, became the heart of the city's resistance. The battle had lost all form. Tanks fired at point-blank range through collapsed walls. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand in stairwells, trading grenades through holes in the floors. Entire units vanished into smoke and never returned. The Germans named the ruins after the buildings they occupied: the Paulos house car, the grain elevator, the tractor plant. These names became symbols of resistance and suffering. In one sector, a group of Soviet soldiers led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov defended an apartment block overlooking the Volga. For nearly 2 months, they held it against relentless assaults. The Germans threw tanks, artillery, and flamethrowers at the building, but it stood, its walls blackened, windows shattered, yet still defiant. From its ruins, Soviet machine guns swept the streets below, cutting down every attempt to advance. Pavlov's house became a legend, a monument to endurance amid annihilation. As the fighting dragged on, morale among the Germans began to fracture. Letters home grew darker. Men wrote not of victory, but of survival. The rations were frozen, the bread hard as stone. The sick and wounded filled basements. Lice spread through the trenches, frostbite through the ranks. The once proud divisions of the Wehrmacht were reduced to fragments, yet Hitler demanded more. From his headquarters in East Prussia, he ordered Paulus to take Stalingrad at any cost. No retreat was permitted. The Sixth Army pressed on, unaware that the tide of war was about to turn. Far to the north and south of the city, Soviet forces were gathering. Entire armies, hidden in the snow and steppe, were preparing to strike. Their plan, codenamed Operation Uranus, was designed not to break into Stalingrad but to encircle it. The Red Army would hit the flanks of the German lines, where Romanian and Italian divisions held weak defensive positions. The plan had been months in the making, and now in mid-November it was ready. At dawn on November 19, 1942, the steppe erupted. The sound of artillery echoed for miles, thousands of guns firing in unison. Soviet Katyusha rockets streaked across the sky, leaving trails of fire and smoke. The Romanian Third Army, caught completely off guard, disintegrated under the bombardment. Within hours, Soviet tanks broke through, racing toward the rear of the German Sixth Army. To the south, another assault crushed the Romanian Fourth Army. The two spearheads drove deep into the enemy's rear, moving to meet each other west of the city. Inside Stalingrad, Paulus received frantic reports, but could not grasp the scale of what was happening. The Germans believed it was another localized attack, but within 4 days the truth was undeniable. The Sixth Army was surrounded. Nearly 300,000 Axis troops were trapped inside the Stalingrad pocket. The encirclement closed near the town of Kalach on November 23rd. Soviet forces met. Shaking hands on the frozen road, the noose was complete. The Sixth Army had become a fortress without supplies, cut off from the outside world. Hitler forbade any breakout attempt. He promised that the Luftwaffe would resupply them by air. Göring assured him it could be done. In reality, it was impossible. The airfields were too far, the weather too severe, and Soviet fighters too aggressive. Inside the pocket, desperation took hold. The temperature dropped below 20 degrees. Fuel froze in barrels. Horses were slaughtered for food. Bread rations were reduced to a few ounces per day. Soldiers burned furniture for heat. Frostbite claimed more men than bullets. The wounded froze to death in unheated bunkers. Yet still they fought on, following orders that no longer made sense. The Soviet front lines tightened, pressing closer every day. Chuikov's men attacked from the east, while armored columns closed in from the west. German radio messages grew shorter and weaker. Paulus's voice, once calm and assured, became strained. He reported heavy losses and severe supply difficulties, but still refused to surrender. Hitler had promoted him to field marshal, a rank no German officer had ever surrendered at. The message was clear. He was to die in Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe's attempt to supply the pocket collapsed almost immediately. Soviet fighters dominated the skies, shooting down transports as they struggled through snow and fog. Each day, fewer and fewer planes reached the city. The supplies they dropped, ammunition, food, medicine, were scattered by the wind or captured by Soviet troops. The men inside the pocket began to starve. Outside, the Red Army's encirclement grew stronger. Entire tank armies now surrounded the city, and Soviet artillery fired day and night. The steppe was littered with burnt-out vehicles and frozen corpses. What had begun as a German offensive had turned into a Soviet trap. By late December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein attempted a relief operation, Operation Winter Storm. German tanks from the 4th Panzer Army advanced toward Stalingrad from the south, breaking through the Soviet lines and reaching within 30 miles of the city, but they could go no further. The Sixth Army was too weak to assist from inside, and Stalin had already launched another massive counterattack. Manstein's forces were driven back, and the pocket remained sealed. In the ruins of Stalingrad, life had become a nightmare. Soldiers scavenged for anything edible. Rats, frozen potatoes, even leather belts boiled into soup. Medical supplies were gone. Wounded men lay in rows, groaning softly in the cold. The smell of decay hung heavy even in sub-zero air. Discipline began to break down. Officers tried to maintain order, but there was little left to command. The once mighty Sixth Army, the pride of the Wehrmacht, was dying. The men still clung to their posts, manning machine guns that had long since run out of ammunition, holding positions that no longer mattered. The Red Army's artillery rolled closer each day, their guns firing without pause. The new year came quietly. January 1943 dawned over a dead city. Stalingrad was a landscape of frozen ruins, black smoke rising from shattered buildings, the Volga locked beneath thick ice. The wind carried the faint hum of engines, Soviet T-34s moving into position for the final assault. Inside the German lines, Paulus knew the end was near. His men were starving, frostbitten and surrounded. Yet the orders from Berlin remained unchanged. Hold Stalingrad to the last man. The city, once the symbol of conquest, had become the graveyard of an army. By November 1942, the once invincible German Sixth Army was trapped in a deadly vice. The bitter cold had returned, and the mighty Volga was now a frozen wasteland. The Red Army's Operation Uranus had succeeded beyond Soviet expectations, encircling nearly 300,000 Axis soldiers inside Stalingrad. The hunters had become the hunted. Inside the ruined city, German soldiers huddled in basements, shivering, starving and dying. Supplies dropped by Luftwaffe planes were barely enough to sustain a fraction of the men. Frostbite blackened their hands and feet. Their rations dwindled to a few scraps of frozen bread or horse meat. Discipline began to break down, and the men, once proud and confident, whispered of doom. Outside the encirclement, Field Marshal Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, a desperate attempt to break through the Soviet lines and rescue the trapped army. But the Red Army had prepared for this. Soviet T-34s prowled the steppes like steel predators. The German relief force was halted, its hopes shattered under relentless artillery fire. General Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, sent message after message to Hitler, pleading for permission to retreat, but Hitler refused. "Not a step back," came the order from the Führer. The men of Stalingrad would fight to the last bullet, the last breath. The city was to be their grave. Inside their frozen shelters, German soldiers wrote farewell letters home. Some burned their last cigarettes for warmth. Others stared blankly into the night, listening to the howl of the wind that swept through the ruins, a wind heavy with the scent of death and iron. The Soviets closed in from all sides. Every street, every building, every cellar became a miniature battlefield. By late December, the once mighty German front was reduced to pockets of starving, isolated troops. The tide of war had turned. Stalingrad, once a symbol of German power, had become a monument to their downfall. January 1943. The city that once bore the proud name of Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a graveyard. Snow fell silently upon ruins that no longer had names. The Volga River, once a ribbon of steel for Soviet lifelines, had frozen into a mirror of death. Across it faint shadows moved, stretcher-bearers. Soldiers wrapped in rags, faces hollow, eyes lifeless. The German Sixth Army, once numbering more than 250,000 men, now huddled in basements, starving, frostbitten and delirious. Inside those cold, shattered buildings, men whispered prayers in German. Russian and silence. They had come to conquer the Soviet Union. Now they fought for the right to die in warmth. General Friedrich Paulus sat hunched over a flickering lamp in a bunker, beneath the ruins of Stalingrad's Red October factory. On the frozen table before him lay maps that no longer mattered, lines of encirclement drawn by his own enemies. He had become a general without an army. The radio crackled with static, Berlin's voice calling across the void. "Hold Stalingrad at all costs," came the order from Hitler's headquarters. Victory or death, but there was no victory to be found in Stalingrad anymore. Only the sound of snow falling over the dead. The last supplies had vanished weeks ago. Horses had been eaten. Dogs had disappeared. And now in the bitter final weeks, soldiers tore wallpaper from the walls to boil it for glue. A desperate soup of starch and shame. They burned their own boots for warmth. Paulus's adjutant brought him the day's casualty report. It was no longer a list of names, only numbers. But Paulus no longer looked at them. The numbers had lost meaning long ago. Outside, Soviet loudspeakers echoed across the ruins, their metallic voices drifting through smoke and snow. "Surrender, Germans! You are surrounded. You cannot escape. Think of your families. The war is lost here." Some listened. Most didn't. To surrender was treason. To resist was suicide. To live was impossible. On January 10th, the Red Army launched Operation Ring, the final tightening of the noose. From north, south, and west, Soviet artillery opened fire. The barrage shook the earth for miles. The Germans inside Stalingrad had nowhere left to go. In every basement and trench, soldiers prayed that the next shell would be merciful and quick. Those who still could walk tried to man the defenses. Old machine guns frozen solid, rifles useless in the cold. The wounded lay in the snow half-conscious, whispering names that no one would ever hear again. By mid-January, starvation and disease had done more damage than Soviet bullets. Typhus spread through the ranks like fire. The once proud Wehrmacht uniforms now hung like rags over skeletons. In one corner of the shattered city, a German doctor named Dr. Hans Dürer wrote in his diary, "The men no longer fear death. They long for it. Their eyes are like glass. We have no bandages, no food, no medicine, only pain." Paulus still tried to keep discipline, but when he ordered his men to counterattack, only a handful obeyed. Their strength gone, their faith in orders broken. He began to realize that his army was no longer an army. It was a mass of dying men trapped by loyalty. On January 22nd, Paulus radioed to Berlin, "Our troops are collapsing. No ammunition, no food. The wounded cannot be evacuated. The situation is hopeless." The reply came instantly, "The Führer expects you to stand fast." He did not reply. For days after, the Germans fought on, not for victory, but because dying in battle was easier than freezing to death. The Soviets closed in, block by block, ruin by ruin, their red flags fluttering in the smoke. By the end of January, the city was silent again. Then, on January 31st, 1943, the message came across the Soviet radio, "Paulus has surrendered." After 163 days of fighting, the Battle of Stalingrad was over. General Paulus, the man who had once been promised a marshal's baton, was now a prisoner. When Stalin heard the news, he smiled faintly and said, "The German Sixth Army has ceased to exist." In basements and trenches, the surviving soldiers laid down their weapons. Some wept, others stared blankly at the snow. They had come to Stalingrad as conquerors. They left as ghosts. February 1943. The city of Stalingrad had fallen silent. Smoke still drifted lazily over the frozen ruins, curling between shattered chimneys and the twisted frames of bombed-out factories. The once mighty German Sixth Army had ceased to exist. Those who had not been killed were now prisoners, hollow-eyed, frost-bitten ghosts trudging through the snow. It was the end of Hitler's grand campaign in the East and the beginning of the long road backward. In the bitter cold, long columns of German prisoners began their march towards Soviet captivity. Some had no boots, only rags wrapped around their feet. Many had frostbitten faces, their eyes sunken from starvation. Soviet guards marched beside them, rifles slung across their backs, faces hard but not cruel. Even victory felt heavy in this frozen graveyard of men. The snow muffled every sound, footsteps, the crunch of ice, the distant hum of Soviet trucks. The war was not over, but something inside it had changed forever. The camera moved slowly over a long, desolate road lined with bare, frozen trees. Hundreds of German prisoners trudge through knee-deep snow under a grey sky. Their coats hang in tatters, rifles long discarded, and white frost glistens on their hair. The distant smoke of Stalingrad still rises behind them, a black scar against the horizon. The wind howls across the steppe, carrying a hollow sound that echoes like the ghosts of the dead. The atmosphere is painfully real. The silence, the cold, the exhaustion, all visible in every step. Another shot captures a group of Soviet soldiers standing by a broken-down truck at the edge of the column. Their breath fogs the air as they pour steaming tea into tin cups, offering it to the shivering prisoners. A faint moment of humanity flickers in this vast landscape of suffering. The camera focuses on one young Soviet guard, barely 20, his eyes fixed on the men he once feared, now reduced to shadows of their former strength. Behind him, the skeletal remains of a T-34 tank lie half buried in snow, a silent monument to the city's agony. As the march continues, the prisoners pass through what was once the heart of Stalingrad. The camera pans across the wreckage, burned-out streetcars frozen in place, dead horses stiff under layers of snow, and walls riddled with bullet holes. A Soviet nurse moves carefully among the wounded stragglers, wrapping bandages with bare hands red from the cold. Her breath rises like smoke as she whispers words of comfort none of them understand. For a brief moment, the brutality of war feels smaller than the endurance of compassion. The next visual shifts to a makeshift Soviet headquarters inside the ruins of a former department store. Soviet officers crowd around a table cluttered with maps and captured documents. A typewriter clacks in the corner as an officer lists the names of the captured German divisions. Behind him, through shattered windows, the frozen city lies quiet. The camera lingers on a framed photograph of Stalin hanging crooked on the wall, the eyes staring coldly at the men recording history in real time. Farther north, along the Volga's frozen bank, rows of trucks loaded with the wounded and dead rumble slowly across the ice. Soldiers use wooden planks to bridge the cracks in the frozen river. One truck slips, its rear wheels spinning helplessly as men rush to push it free. Their silhouettes move against the dull white glare of the ice, the sound of engines blending with the distant rumble of artillery far beyond the city. Every movement feels heavy, as if the earth itself is mourning. At night, fires flicker across the steppe. Soviet sentries stand guard near makeshift camps, where German prisoners huddle together under tattered blankets. The moonlight reveals their hollow faces, men who once believed they would conquer the world, now reduced to nameless figures fading into the snow. The wind carries the faint creak of frozen fabric, the sound of boots shifting on ice, and the low murmur of soldiers speaking in languages of both victory and defeat. The final visual captures the frozen march from above. The camera rises slowly into the icy morning air, revealing endless lines of men stretching across the white landscape. thousands of dark shapes moving like shadows across a sea of snow. In the distance, Stalingrad burns faintly, its smoke merging with the low clouds. The music fades to a deep, slow hum, like the last heartbeat of a dying city. History records the moment, but only the silence truly understands what was lost here. February 1943. The guns at Stalingrad had fallen silent, but the echoes of the battle would shake the world for generations. The Soviet victory was not just a military triumph, it was a psychological earthquake. For the first time, the world saw that the Wehrmacht, once considered unstoppable, could be defeated. Stalingrad was the turning point, the moment the tide of war began to flow backward toward Berlin. From the frozen ruins, the Red Army emerged battered but unbroken. Over 1.1 million Soviet soldiers had fought, bled and died in that city. The Germans had lost more than 280,000 men, an entire army erased. The Volga, once choked with bodies and wreckage, now lay frozen in silence. Yet beneath that ice, history itself had shifted course. All across Europe, whispers spread. The myth of German invincibility was dead. In the factories of England and America, workers cheered. In the occupied cities of France and Poland, people dared to hope. And in Berlin, for the first time, the word defeat crept into the halls of the Reich Chancellery. Hitler raged, humiliated by the loss of his greatest army. His dream of conquering the East had turned to ash on the banks of the Volga. But for those who had lived through Stalingrad, there was no triumph, only memory. Soviet civilians began to crawl out from the rubble, their faces blank, their eyes hollow from months of siege. They found no homes, only piles of stones and frozen corpses. Yet they began to rebuild, brick by brick, guided by the unspoken truth that survival itself was victory. In the spring thaw, the fields around the city revealed their dead, soldiers of both sides, frozen together in grotesque stillness. The snow melted, and the Volga ran red once more. Mass graves were dug by the thousands. The war moved on, but Stalingrad remained a scar upon the earth, a reminder of the price of human ambition. Years later, historians would call it the turning of the world. From that frozen battlefield rose a new Soviet confidence, one that would drive the Red Army westward through Kursk, through Warsaw, and finally to Berlin itself. Every city liberated bore the silent echo of Stalingrad's defiance. Decades passed. The city was rebuilt, renamed Volgograd, and covered in monuments. The most famous of them all stood upon the Mamayev Kurgan, a colossal statue of a woman, with a sword raised to the heavens. The motherland calls. Beneath her feet lay the bones of 35,000 Soviet soldiers. Tourists walk there today, speaking in whispers, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts that sleep beneath the grass. And yet Stalingrad is not just a story of one battle. It is the story of endurance, of ordinary men and women who refused to yield. It is the moment when the will of a nation, starving and cornered, proved stronger than the machinery of conquest. It is where the world began to change direction. The silence of that city still speaks, through the wind, through the photographs, through the eyes of those who remember.